Welcome to SIR Studios Inside the Issue. Today's guest is Richard Holinger, whose story Before Saying Goodbye is featured in the spring 2024 issue of Southern Indiana Review. Richard Hollinger's fiction, essays, poetry, and book reviews have appeared in the Southern Review, Boulevard, North American Review, the Iowa Review, Western Humanities Review, Witness, Chicago Quarterly, Chautauqua, and elsewhere. He's a four-time Pushcart nominee and a two-time Best of the Net nominee. His book of poetry, North of Crivitz, and a collection of essays, Kangaroo Rabbits and Galvanized Fences, have garnered praise respectively from Kevin Stein, former Illinois Poet Laureate, and David Hamilton, editor emeritus of the Iowa Review. Not Everybody's Nice won the 2012 Split Oak Press Prose Chapbook contest, and Kattywompus Press published Hybrid Seeds, Little Fictions, a chapbook of innovative writing. Richard's degrees include a PhD in creative writing from the University of Illinois at Chicago and an MA in English from Washington University. He facilitates the Night Writers Workshop and writes a bi-monthly newspaper column for Shaw Media. He has taught at the university, community college, and secondary school levels. He lives west of Chicago. Richard, welcome to Inside the Issue.
Thank you, Casey, and thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear. I'm excited to talk about your story. So before we get going on it, would you mind, because it's a flash piece, would you mind reading the whole thing for us?
Be glad to.
Thank you.
Before saying goodbye, there are things to do, like thank the hostess and host for a fine time, even though the baked potato could have used 10 minutes more at 300 plus degrees, or ask select guests for their email addresses, and maybe even phone numbers to maybe ask them over for a dinner like this one. Or help bring half-empty glasses and dessert plates from the living room to the kitchen, even though the drinks were weak as a cell phone connection on the farthest Aleutian island. Or search my pockets for phone, eye drops, and pillbox, making sure one or the other wasn't left on a bathroom sink or coffee table. Or take my 1030s, so I can fall asleep the minute I reach home. No muss or fuss about who said what to whom tonight. So I can fall asleep. Who made an ass of himself by going on about Maui, when there on his first marriage's honeymoon, perched on a jet ski, skimming over the Pacific Ocean, turned on by its churning, pounding waves, leading to doing it doggy style. Superb, but maybe not fit for this elegant dinner party with people he first met only hours before, over prosciutto and melon wraps, brie cheese and gluten-free crackers. Or take my coat from the hanger where the hostess hung it, open the front door, get in my car, and drive to an all-night Denny's before anyone, including my third wife, gets wind of my leaving and asks about my whereabouts and what's with him.
All right, thank you. Where did this story come from? Where was the genesis or the seed for this piece?
I believe I wrote it, I think, a few months ago. I believe it came from such a dinner party as one might be described in here. One of those dinner parties where one is kind of putting up with the chatter and not being all that enthralled in being there. But certainly this is a fiction, and it's hyperbolized. And I think that's where the fun of it is for me when writing it. You take a particular situation that most of us have been through, mm-hmm. and you just make a satire of it, essentially. So I think that's pretty much where it came from, whether it was the next morning wanting to vent, or after it sort of settled for a while. I'm not sure about that, Casey.
Yeah, no, I mean, it read to me, I mean, I suspected it came from not of course personal experience, like the narrator is you, of course, but this feeling of like, yeah, this feels like a response to kind of those experiences where you're there and it's just kind of inane conversations going on and you're and it captures that feeling incredibly well, I think. So this was your process for writing this one, and if you could talk about flash fiction more broadly, was your process for writing this different or similar to other stories, other flash pieces?
Fairly similar to most other flash pieces. Starting off something like this, I'm really not sure where it's going. I'm not sure how long it's going to be. Sometimes I'll show a writer friend a piece of my flash fiction, and he said, "Great start to a novel." um, he wants more. But I think this piece, I think the initial draft flowed very quickly. And getting into the revision of it a little bit, I think once it was finished and maybe set aside for a few days, I went back to it and started tweaking it. The areas that I wanted to punctuate included that cell phone connection. I don't think the Aleutian Island reference was in the original draft. I'm sure the sexual scene was pumped up because that had to be, ludicrous to make the well, maybe not ludicrous for some, ludicrous for me, um, to make the piece work. I think he might have had. I think he might have been talking about his wife in the first version, but I made it his third wife in the final version, again, to kind of show the kind of poor life that this guy has fallen into. And I think the reader recognizes that even if he doesn't, because obviously for me, he's showing off, he's trying to impress his audience there. And we, the reader, find that kind of pitiable. At least that's, I think, what ultimately I wanted the piece to show.
Yeah, I mean, he seems to be a guy who believes people are enthralled by him, and we recognize him as a guy who believes people are enthralled by him, right? Maybe
Yes.
a blowhard or something. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting you say. So do you, when you're writing flash, I mean, you said you always don't know how long it's going to be. Do you tend to have a sense of that and then react as the piece develops? Because I think I'm trying to think, there are times when I've like, no, I'm writing a flash piece, and of course it doesn't obey. And then other times where I think
Right.
it's something bigger, and it turns out to be something, just a glimpse of something.
Right.
Is that
Right.
something? Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Yeah, yeah. I write a lot of poetry too, and when I start a poem, there's not the angst of having to write a short story, and I think with Flash, that's the same thing, and it's delightful for me in sitting down to write a piece of fiction, not knowing where it's going. If there does seem to be kind of a sense of closure after. Remember reading Barry Selesky's collection of prose poems. He was the former editor at another Chicago magazine, and he came out with a book, and the title of the book was described. The interior of the book was described as flash fictions. And I talked to Barry about it, and I said, I love your book. He said, well, actually, those are all prose poems, and the publisher did not want to put prose poems on the cover, so he made them flash fictions. And of course, the term microfiction was not around at that point. This is in the 80s, 70s, 80s, I think. So, you know, how to describe a hybrid, a flash
Sure.
fiction, a microfiction, it's tough. But this just seemed to have a sense of closure after that, at that point.
Well, I mean, I think too the shape of this, I mean, it works, right? It's you got to leave the party at some point, and I mean, it has it has this natural conclusion that fits really well. You're talking about the difference between prose poems and flash fiction, and you know, I'm not the person to describe the difference, but I was at it was probably AWP several years ago. I mean, maybe 10 years ago, and there was I think Stuart Diebeck was doing a reading, and either he brought it up or someone asked about prose poems versus flash.
Mm.
And you know, being the writer that the stature that he is, he can operate this way, but he's like, I don't care. He's like, I write what I write and I send it, and if an editor wants to put it in the poetry section of the journal, that's where they put it. If they wanted to put it in the fiction, that's where they put it. And there, you know, luxury of being him, he can do that. But I think there's something really kind of freeing about that. It's like, who cares, right? You made a piece of art, and everything else is just a label, right? Particularly when we're talking about prose poetry, because you know, it doesn't follow any of the at least outward rules of what you know. We don't look at it and immediately think, oh, that's a poem.
Yep, absolutely, and I think that in a way frees writers up these days, that
Yeah.
they don't have to sit down and write a sonnet with iambic pentameter and, you know, certain rhyme scheme. You know, whatever the muse gives them, they start penning it or typing it and see what happens.
Yeah. So one of the things that I'm curious about in this one, it might not have come across in your reading, but it's one sentence. This story is one sentence, and I don't remember what the word count is. But I'm curious if that was an intent from the beginning, or like a kind of a constraint you put on yourself, or if that's just how it appeared, or if that was a revision choice, or if you could talk about the structure of it being one sentence.
I wish I could remember, Casey. I sort of think that it might have begun as a conventional paragraph with many sentences. And then I thought, no, this is stream of consciousness. I just want to hear what this guy is thinking about without any major pauses. Yes, there are a bunch of semicolons in it. More for the rhythm than anything else. I didn't want to run through this quickly, or the reader to run through it quickly. I wanted there to be a slow, kind of almost a slow motion movement through. This is what he's thinking of when this, you know, dull conversations are going on around him. But yeah, that might have been a revision of the piece.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's, you know, I guess regardless of intent, because, you know, I think as we know, that probably doesn't matter much. I think it fits, it's the right choice, whether it was a choice or not, whether it was instinct or choice. I think it works really well for this, because it fits this character, right? This guy who's kind of, you know, not rambling is not the right word, but as I said before, kind of full of himself, and, you know, pontificating kind of at a party. And I think this, you know, not the fact that there are no hard pauses, no one else gets to talk, right? He doesn't stop.
Right.
So that just really, I don't know. I think it's you know, regardless of how it came about, it's the right choice for the story, I think.
Thank you.
The other main question I have, and I'm interested because Ron Mitchell, the editor-in-chief of SIR, and I were talking about this, and it's the thing that really drew us into the story, is about midway in, the narrator says, he refers to another person specifically, who made an ass of himself by going on and on about Maui, and that's when like the sexual exploits get talked about. And I'm curious who I read that a particular way, and Ron did too. And I'm curious to hear how you read that moment in this story.
I'm so glad you picked up on that. He at that point, it's almost like a turn in a sonnet, you know, after 8 lines. And I didn't realize that when I was writing it. It was totally unconscious. But he starts to objectify himself by talking himself as though it's someone else. I think the reader picks up right away that it is he.
Mm-hmm.
it's almost a self-confession that he's not even realizing that he's making. And of course, as we talked about before, he thinks his exploits are marvelous, and I think the reader is understanding something very different. So that ironic turn, I'm really glad you picked up on. And the last part of it is kind of like a wish fulfillment. And the contrast, I think, between his description of sex on the pounding waves versus what he ends up doing or wishes to do, which is just to go out to Denny's and get away from it all. There's such a wonderful contrast between that life that he may have lived at one point, and then the life that he has now, escaping his third wife, the first two being failures and looking like the third one might be a failure as well.
Yeah. No,
So,
that moment in the story when we get that, like I said, it's not really a point of view switch, but we get a switch to referencing like a singular person. And I mean, it's him, right? And I think that's the thing for us that really, set the story, push the story, really pushed it forward for us, because it's like, oh, that's that, where this man, we have that moment as a reader where, as you've alluded to, like, we know something about him that he doesn't know, and or something he's unaware of, or something he's unwilling to recognize about himself, and that just creates a really great tension, I think, in such a short piece. And calling it like a turn in a sonnet, I think that's really the right way to think about this, right? Because that is the hinge upon which this piece sort of turns. And I think that's that's spot on. Even more broadly, we talked a little bit about flash fiction, but I mean, like, what draws you to it, perhaps? And I think you've already alluded to this a little bit, being writing poetry also, and maybe the what seems to be counterintuitive, but the freedom of the confined space of flash, perhaps. But as somebody who's written, this isn't your only flash piece, for example. So what are your thoughts about that form more broadly, or about what role it plays, or what the draw is for you?
I love the feel of it, because it's so, for me, it's non-demanding. It's undemanding. Sitting down to write a short story, unless it starts writing itself, I find almost as painful as writing a novel. And I've written 4 novels that are in the drawer, and so I've always gone back to fiction, and I just find that pinpoint of focus on one moment can be so revealing, just as in a poem. But it's freer than a poem, and many of my microfictions have been turned into poems, and some of my poems have been turned into microfictions, and without much compression or enlargement, because I think a microfiction has to be as compressed as a poem, and there has to be that last line that either changes the entire poem or solidifies the entire poem. And I think, I mean, a good short story will do that, but I don't think without the punch of a microfiction or a poem, if the imagery and the movement and the rhythms have all been done well.
No, yeah. I mean, I think you're right. I think that flash or micro pieces probably do share, as much or more with poetry than any other form, because of like things like a turn, or that image generally an image or a line or something that sticks at the end that destabilizes everything we've just read, or as you said, reinforces things or changes something slightly. I think it's funny, and I know exactly what you mean when you say that Flash is non-demanding, but that's funny because it's such a demanding form otherwise, because I mean, generally industry wide, 1,000 and under is Flash. I mean, it's sometimes 750, but it actually is demanding, but there's something freeing in those constraints. I try to tell students this all the time, and I don't think they believe me until they try it, that providing yourself with a constraint, whatever it is, frees you up in ways that seem counterintuitive, but it's true. And I don't know how that works, but it's true.
Well, and some writers that you talk to just can't write flash fiction or microfiction. They say, "Oh no, I've got to develop my character. I've got to write a setting. I've got to do X, Y, and Z, and there's no way I can do something that's that compressed."
Yeah, and I think the you mentioned before, like pinpoint focus. I think it's called Flash for a reason, right? It's this glimpse, it's this flash upon a character, and we don't need to know about this guy, right? We don't need to know how tall he is or what kind of house this party exists in. The details suggest certain things that the world opens up for us without you having to actually tell us. Right.
Exactly. Mention brie cheese, mention, opening the pillbox before you go to bed.
Mm-hmm.
Those little details, I think, just open the world to most people that know that sort of existence.
And the fact that he wants to go to a Denny's says a lot too, because that's
right.
It's not the opposite of this party, but it's this seems to be a fairly kind of upscale, swanky sort of dinner party, and he just wants to go to Denny's, which is not swanky. At least my experience of Denny's has not been swanky or upscale, especially late at night.
Yeah. Again, the Denny's was hopefully would suggest that he wants to go someplace he's not known. He just wants to rid himself of this life that he's leading, that he cannot escape, which is again very, very pitiable for the man.
Yeah. So shifting gears a little bit, what writers for you are or were foundational when you were starting out, and even remain foundational to you, or writers that you come back to again and again?
I'll start with a story. When I left college, didn't know what I wanted to do, knew I didn't want to keep going to school. So I lived in New Haven and got a job as a nighttime security guard at a big cold storage warehouse, so that I could write in the morning, write stories. And the first story I wrote was called The Observer, and I grew up in a tall apartment building on Lakeshore Drive in Chicago. And my brothers and I, when we were, youngsters, would take our binoculars and, look into the other apartments around. And the story of The Observer is about a professional observer who tracks every window that he sees. So he becomes, of course, the symbol of the artist, recording but not partaking in life. And eventually he finds somebody observing him. He goes over to the apartment. He goes in. Of course, it's himself, looking at himself, blah, blah, blah. So I sent this off, humble as always, to Esquire.
Yeah.
And it comes back with their little rejection slip on it, thank you for sending, blah, blah, blah. But then handwritten was, I love this story, but the telling leaves me cold. And that told me everything about my writing, Casey, that I needed to know. I had been reading Lovecraft and, all this stuff with pretentious vocabulary. And so when I went to Washington University, I took a tutorial with the poet Donald Finkel, and he immediately, prescribed Hemingway. And so I started reading, the Nick Adams stories, and so from there it was, Salinger's 9 stories, and I still read Hemingway. I reread The Garden of Eden recently and just found it masterful. So I think that's really what started me off, simplifying and clarifying my language. And after teaching high school for 40 years, I think a major influence were the classics that I was reading: Huck Finn, Separate Peace, Catcher in the Rye. And my first novel was about 2 high school kids who hitchhiked down to St. Louis. So it's a retelling of Huck Finn. And so I think that's really where I'd want to start in answering that question. Since then, obviously, I've leaned out to so many other writers. I wrote down a few. Norman MacLean. I fly fish, so A River Runs Through It is just, I keep rereading that, every few years. I started early with T.C. Boyle's earlier works. His early stories, and his novel Water Music was just, I thought, brilliant, and I don't think he's ever matched that or some of his earlier stories. New York Trilogy, Auster, just blew my mind. I've been trying to read a lot of comic novels because I love comic novels. So John Hassler's Staggerford. I just, of course, saw American Fiction and listened to Erasure. And the reader of Erasure is brilliant. I listened to recorded books back to the cassette tape era, and his reading of Erasure, just, I was laughing nonstop practically. It's just a brilliant thing. George Saunders' early satires I loved. Kafka hooked me on, Kafka and Marquez hooked me on magic realism. So I'll stop there because
No, that's great. No,
I could go on.
Yeah, no, I think that yeah, I think so many, probably, I don't want to say exclusively, probably male writers are probably drawn to Hemingway early. Especially coming out of, because a lot of the things that might hook us into reading are, like you mentioned, the Lovecraft and the Poe and those things that don't really, they're of a time, right? And they can't, I still have students who want to write poetry that sounds like that. And I'm like, that doesn't play anymore. And it's almost like that, those early 20th century writers kind of reset things for us. I think for the better, but that's my reading on that. What about writers? I think most of the ones you mentioned, for the most part, are really well known. Are there any writers that are unsung, or ones that you feel like, or that you're always trying to get people to read, or that you feel like should be read more?
Yeah, and I should have mentioned Toni Morrison in that bunch, because her Beloved just blew me away, and others of her work. As far as the unsung authors, there was a poet who lived in Elburn, which is very near where I live, northwest of Chicago, named Dave Etter, and I just looked him up on some website this morning of 18 famous Illinois poets, and he was not mentioned. Of course, Sandburg was there, and Edgar Lee Masters. But Dave Etter took something like the Spoon River Anthology and updated it to the late 1900s, and just wrote these wonderful little portraits of Midwestern voices, and each poem is the name of the person whose voice is speaking the poem. I think that's in a collection called Sunflower County. But he and I were friends, and we did readings together, and just marvelous stuff. a friend of mine named Pat Parks, who's a local writer, wrote a novel called Two Come Carry, which is kind of a blend of Marquez and Stanley Elkin and Samuel Beckett. I mean, it's just wonderfully evocative. And I don't. There's a writer named Teddy Wayne. I think he's at Washington University. I'm not sure. He wrote a novel called The Great Man Theory, and it's kind of in those the school of novels. The cranky guy leaves society and tries to live on his own and slowly goes downhill emotionally. But it's very funny and just so well crafted. There was also a man who was part of my one of my workshops called Harold Walker. And at 12 years old, he experienced a murder and a retribution murder in his small town on his family's farm. Wow. In Missouri, rural Missouri. And he wrote a nonfiction book called Murder on the Floodways, which is just a wonderfully crafted book. And then he's been writing a trilogy of his memoirs as a helicopter pilot in Vietnam in 69 and 70. And I think it's called the Grotto trilogy. And I think he's working on the third one right now. So those are the ones that come to mind right away, Casey.
Oh, that's great. Actually, I think I've read, did Teddy Wayne write a novel called The Apartment?
Yes, that was his first one, and I have not read it, but I just ordered it, as a matter of fact. How did you like that?
It's been a while. I remember liking it. I think it has to do. I think it's about one of the characters is a writer. I think
Yes.
maybe in grad school, probably in New York City, if I remember correctly. And there's some. I can't recall the details, but I remember. He the writer is kind of the stand-in, I'm assuming, for a Wayne type character.
Yeah.
I'm totally speculating, but it felt kind of quasi autobiographical, at least.
Yes.
Yeah. So last question, if you don't mind, what are you working on?
Well, as I said, I've been writing novels for years, and once I tried to write a thriller because I thought, well, geez, I can write fairly well. Let me make some money off of it. I sat down, wrote 3 chapters, and then I said, no, this is totally hypocritical. I can't write it. I was listening to a interview with Salman Rushdie the other day, about his book Knife that he's just come out with, and he said, because the interviewer asked him, why are you writing this? Why not another novel? He said, you have to write what you have to. You can, if you try to write something else, you're doomed. So he realized he had to get this cathartic novel or a cathartic memoir out of the way first. So what I started doing was writing a couple of pretty much autofiction stories of a character named Henry who grows up in a privileged family and in Chicago, as I mentioned, on Lakeshore Drive. And I think I'm going to title it the Tragic Life of Henry Holcomb Esquire, because although he is being brought up in a family of means and professionals, I try to get into what's happening to him emotionally and the traumas that he faces. Extremely sensitive. He gets homesick very easily. They send him away to camp and so forth, and just trying to create kind of a Winesburg, Ohio thing, or the things they carried thing. Somebody said, well, is it a novel or a collection of short stories? Well, is it microfiction or a poem, or I don't know yet. And as you say, I don't have Stuart Dybeck's reputation, so I probably can't send it to Simon and Schuster and say, this is what it is, you figure it out. But I do, I have a collection of short fiction and a collection of creative nonfiction that I've been submitting, many of which have been in literary magazines. And unfortunately, my muse is can't concentrate on one particular theme or setting. She or he gives me all different kinds of inspiration, which is wonderful, but they don't necessarily gel well. So hopefully the Henry stories with Henry as a prominent main character and other characters that appear often will hold together better.
Yeah, so that reminds me, there's a do you know John McNally's work?
I don't.
The Chicago writer. He doesn't live in Chicago anymore, but he grew up in Chicago. He has a novel called The Book of Ralph.
Okay.
And it's kind of what you're talking about. I think so I think his first book came out as a collection of stories, and I think there were a couple Ralph stories in it. And then so he has this, it's a novel, but it probably could have just as easily been a collection of stories. I believe he is releasing or coming out with like the 20th anniversary edition of it, but it's The Book of Ralph, and it's about a kid named Ralph who grows up on the south side of Chicago. And I think, he's like a middle schooler, early high school age kid getting into trouble. And you might check it out because it's similar to a kind of Weinsberg or a book like that but updated.
I'm thinking this is not good, Casey.
I think it sounds a little different because I think the era is probably a little bit different. I think McNally's character is coming of age like in the late 70s, early 80s, I think. But yeah, and it's funny. So yeah, you either check it out or avoid it, I guess I should say.
Exactly. I know nothing. No, I'm delighted to know about it, and I definitely we'll check it out.
All right, great. So you can find Richard's story Before Saying Goodbye in the spring 24 issue of SIR. You can go to usi.edu/SIR to find out how to get a copy. And the link will also be in the description. Thank you again, Richard, for joining me.
Casey, it's been a delight. Thank you so much.
All right, well, we appreciate it. We'll see everybody on the next one. Thank you again.
Bye.